were pretty much the purview of the wealthy and the extremely gifted through the first half of the 20th century. This is Tarzan right here. That's Johnny Weissmuller. He was an Olympic champion. He was from California. Very strong, very powerful, very ripped guy. So they decided to make him Tarzan. And in his first movie, he looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, he's just buff as all. He looks like a swimmer, okay? But then they started feeding him too much. He got a little bit pudgy. So anyway, Buster Crabbe was another Tarzan that was a championship swimmer. So the reality was, in the beginning of the 20th century, and you may think that the Olympics are kind of silly. These guys don't get paid. Everybody has to be an amateur. They can never have played professional sports. They've changed the rules a little bit, but in the beginning, the reason they did that was because it was just for rich people. It was just for the wealthy and for the gifted. And if somebody was gifted, the problem was that the wealthy people wanted an advantage, and the advantage they had was the fact that they had enough money that they didn't have to worry about, eating and things like that. But they couldn't compete against these really, really good guys. These poor guys that worked their tails off to become good athletes. So what they did, and of course they couldn't survive unless they sold themselves to professional teams and whatnot. So they made rules. They made rules that everybody had to be an amateur, and this excluded all those really good athletes, the Jim Thorpes and whatnot. Jim Thorpe lost all of his medals because he had played semi-pro ball in West Virginia or something one summer. He won the Olympics almost all by himself, but he lost all of his medals because of that. So it seemed a little silly, but of course that was because the wealthy people were controlling everything. So nobody really cheated. I mean, there wasn't any reason to cheat. And if they did cheat, of course, nobody cared because none of this stuff was illegal at the time. Then the Cold War happened after World War II. After World War II, it was the communists versus the people that weren't communists. The communists wanted to show that communism was superior. And the way they did that was by showing that their athletes were better. My athletes are better than your athletes. It was one of those kind of deals. So anytime they could compete against the Western world, the Eastern Bloc countries, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, the Soviet Union, of course, they tried to win. They wanted to win. They wanted to show that they were better than Europeans. They wanted to show that they were better than Americans. It was the East Germans that came up with with this anabolic steroid stuff. Anabolic steroids are synthetic steroids, and they work better than normal steroids. And they're the ones that came up with the whole formula. And they experimented with their athletes, and their female athletes were amazing. Their female athletes were almost like guys. Some of them did, and some of them actually turned out to be guys. Well, they didn't turn out to be guys, but they changed into males because they took so much steroids. This is one of the examples. This lady, who as you can see is female, on the left, when she was competing, she was female, and then of course, she took so many steroids, she started growing hair in male places, and she converted to being male. And this happened all over the Eastern Bloc. The sad part was that as a female, of course she could have babies, but the more steroids she took, the less likely that she was ever going to have children. And a lot of them just became transgender individuals because of their steroid usage. This was going on all the way through the 60s into the 70s. Finally they banned them. And of course the wall went down in 1989. The two Germanys got together, and there's just tons and tons of stories about the West Germans and the East Germans yelling at each other about their sports teams. The world, of course, was appalled by all of this. They saw all these women with these shoulders like guys, and they decided that they were going to do something about it. So in 1968, they outlawed steroids, as weird as that seems. And today, all steroids are banned by just about all amateur organizations. NCAA, of course, bans lots of different things. Anything that is performance enhancing. We've had a problem with this in baseball. In the 1980s, steroids hit baseball. By the 1990s, they were using it almost routinely. It was during the 1990s, of course, that Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire had their home run derby. And Mark McGwire won by 2 home runs, and then he hit 70 home runs in a season. And then, of course, Barry Bonds in 2000, was it 1999 or 2001? Anyway, Barry Bonds broke the record. And of course, he was on steroids as well. So this has been a problem. Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds, none of them are in the Hall of Fame because their records are tainted. As odd as it seems, sedatives have been used since the beginning of the 20th century in the form of bromides, chloral hydrate, and peraldehyde. Barbitol was marketed as Veronal in 1903. Phenobarbital was developed in 1913. And now these are drugs, and these are drugs you can go to the drugstore and get. So there were a lot of people that were taking sedatives at night to sleep, and then of course they were sleeping for 10 or 12 hours. Everybody was happy, until of course they became addicted to these things. So if you watch old movies from the 1930s and 1940s, they may talk about phenobarbital or barbitol or Veronal, and of course what they're talking about are these sedatives that people were addicted to. They became very popular during the Depression and World War II. People had a lot of worries during the Depression since there were so few people working. There wasn't a lot of food out there. Actually, there was a lot of food out there, but nobody had the money to buy it. That was the problem. So there were a lot of worries out there, and people would take care of their worries by taking sleeping substances, sedatives. And of course, during World War II, their men were off to war, so a lot of women back home they were worried about their husbands in combat, and I'll tell you, it was pretty bad. World War II, we lost a lot of men during World War II. We were fighting on 2 different fronts. We were losing a lot of guys in the Pacific. We were losing a lot of guys in Europe after 1940, after D-Day. There were letters coming in all the time about men who had died in combat. So there were a lot of women that were worried that their husbands weren't coming back. My mother was pregnant at the time. Yeah, my dad, I told you, my dad landed at D-Day and he marched all the way through France and Belgium. He was in the Bulge, then he marched through Germany. My mother was pregnant at the time, but she was a nurse, so she had something to do. As long as she could stay busy, she was okay. And not only that, her mother was dying of cancer, and she had to take care of the farm. So she was milking the cows and feeding the chickens, taking care of her mother, and going to work, and making sure her baby was okay. Unfortunately, my sister was a really strange baby. She didn't move a whole lot, and it scared my mother. Of course, my mother was a nurse, so she knew about quickening, she knew about babies moving and whatnot. And my sister hardly ever moved, so a lot of times she was afraid that that something had happened to the baby. She turned out okay, everything was fine. But the odd thing was, as a baby she never moved, and as an adult she never moved. Right? She never moved. She was just she was a weird kid. I call her a kid. She's older than I am. What am I talking about? Over 50 different barbiturates dominated the market at this time. They were just all over the place. And doctors would prescribe them to women who were worried. This is, now they give people Valium in those days, or Xanax. In those days, of course, they just gave you phenobarbital or barbitol. Or you're having problems sleeping? Here, take this and this will help you. In the 1950s, doctors realized that they had not only overprescribed the drugs, surprise, surprise, but they had created a whole generation of addicted adults. This happens over and over and over again. We've got a miracle drug, so let's use it as much as we possibly can. Maybe it will solve everybody's problems. Doctors get on the bandwagon, they start prescribing just buckets and buckets of this stuff, and all of a sudden they realize, oh my God, look what I've done. That's what's happening with the painkillers right now. That's what happened with Valium and Librium during the Vietnam War. We had lots of, I told you the story, we used to get, in the pharmacy they used to get all of their containers. The biggest container they had was a gallon container of pills. They used to get Valium and Librium in 5-gallon buckets. That's how much it was, and they were military buckets. Normally, if you ordered pharmaceuticals, you got them in the pharmaceutical containers. These came in military buckets of 5-gallon buckets. So we were getting that many pills. And if you went in, if an individual went in and said, "Gee, I'm worried about my husband. He's over in Vietnam. He's flying sorties, 2 or 3 sorties a day. I'm so scared he's going to be killed." They just throw Valium and Librium at you and put you to sleep, so that you didn't worry about your husband. They overprescribed them. Valium and Librium are both addictive drugs, and we had a lot of women coming out of the Vietnam War. Even though they weren't fighting in the war, they came out as addicts, as sad as that may seem. 1950s and 1960s, a whole group of milder tranquilizers were developed to replace the more dangerous tranquilizers. Miltown and benzodiazepines such as Librium and Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, and Halcyon became the most widely used drugs in the world. Valium was the most widely used drug in the world until Prozac. Everybody took Valium. They took it at a different strength. The wonderful thing about Valium, if today it works, tomorrow it won't, because it won't be strong enough for you, but they had a lot of different increments of pills so that they could give you a stronger dosage. And people would talk about what their dosage of Valium was. Well, I'm taking 50 milligrams of Valium 3 times a day, and their friend would say, well, I'm taking 75 milligrams of Valium a day. and then, of course, the old drunk in the corner is going, oh yeah? Well, I'm taking 100 milligrams of Valium a day. I take enough Valium to kill a horse. And they would have these stupid conversations. Ergot or barley rust has created havoc wherever it has appeared, and we didn't know why. They would have barley rust, and nobody would realize it because, well, it's a fungus, and you can barely see it. And then all of a sudden they would feed it to somebody, and then they'd go just bonkers. And of course it would kill people, and people. So they had to start cleaning their barley, and they had to start cleaning their wheat before they milled it to get rid of all this ergot. Well, this Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, he looked into this, trying to figure out what was going on. And what he discovered was lysergic acid diethylamide. He discovered LSD. Ergot, the active ingredient in ergot is lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. And he was able to synthesize it. It's a fairly simple chemical formula, sadly enough. So anybody that knows anything about chemistry, if you're a good chemist, you can make LSD. Okay. If you've ever seen Breaking Bad, if you're a good chemist, you can make crystal meth. It's not that hard. After his discovery, Hoffman accidentally dosed himself. Sadly enough, it doesn't take a whole lot of LSD to send you on a trip. A drop, even less than a drop. Just a tiny, tiny amount. 5 micrograms of LSD will send you on a pretty good trip. So you can splash this stuff in your eye. You don't have to splash a gallon of it in your eye. You just have to splash a drop of it in your eye. And that's what happened to Hoffman. He was working along, and back in these days, you didn't really put on goggles to do chemical experiments. Nobody thought about doing that or wearing gloves or any of this other stuff. This wasn't dangerous. There weren't any acids, so he wasn't really worried about it. And he splashed the stuff in his eye, got under his glasses, and it got into his eye. And of course, then he took a trip, and he went, "Oh my God, that's the reason that this stuff is causing so much trouble." And so he wrote a paper about it. But it was a secret paper. This is in 1938. It was a secret paper, and as soon as it came out, the American government bought it. The American government, so that they kept him from telling anybody else. So all the way through World War II, we had chemists in the United States trying to do something with this stuff. And eventually it made its way to the CIA. So the CIA decided that they were going to try to weaponize it. You know, we could spray it on combat troops and they would all start tripping out and they couldn't fight. How about that? That sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? So they experimented with the stuff, and the program was called MK Ultra. And they would dose military personnel. And sometimes they drive them insane with LSD, you know, that's the way it works. So they were trying this stuff out through the 50s and 60s. It was just a ton of fun. They sprayed it in a subway in Philadelphia, and trying to see if they could weaponize the stuff. It didn't work, of course. They had all kinds of scientists all over the United States doing all this secret stuff. One of them was a guy by the name of Timothy Leary. He was a doctor of chemistry at Harvard University. Brilliant, brilliant guy. Well, he dosed himself. He splashed some of this stuff in his eye, just like Hoffman did. And when he did that, he had a psychedelic experience. So he decided everybody needs this stuff. So he's the one that started the whole LSD psychedelic craze in the United States. And this is in 1958. Timothy Leary lived for a long time. He died about 5 years ago, I think. Anyway, when he died, of course, he's the one that came out. He left education and he started going around the country swearing that this stuff was so mind-expanding and mind-blowing. Of course, he didn't do anything after this except try to sell LSD. He didn't do anything. So he's this chemist. He's this brilliant chemist that was not only a research chemist but also a teacher, and he stopped doing that. He didn't do anything for the rest of his life except try to push drugs. What a guy. So after he died, he had his body cremated and they shot it up into space, which is kind of exciting if you think about it, I know. The last mind-expanding experiment. What a goofball. 1.5 million people drink alcohol around the world. 76 million of these people have an alcohol abuse disorder, including this guy. He looks like a fun fella. I'm not sure what 21 stands for, but it's cold out there and he's got sandals on. That's pretty good. He's got his 2 bottles of wine, I guess. He's pretty red-faced. 21. Okay. Cool. Anyway, 76 million people have an alcohol problem. 1.5 billion people. There's 7 billion people, and we're getting close to 8 billion people in the world. But there's only maybe 2 billion people in the world that actually drink alcohol. When I was up in Montana, they couldn't believe that I didn't drink. As far as they knew, that everybody drank. You know, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the Grove up in Minnesota, not your people. Your people are.
Okay.
Yeah, no, they're not. I've been to Browning. I know how bad it is.
It's not bad.
Yes, it is.
No, it is not. I think that statement right there it's kind of like anywhere you go, you know, in basically almost every reservation, because we have alcohol abuse here, but it's more hidden.
Right.
We have drug abuse here, but it's more hidden.
Right.
And people here do it in their own way. People back home do it in their own way. People in Fort Belknap do it in their own way.
Right.
And then I seen a meme that said, Trump flew over Browning and said, oh crap, where's that at? We might as well put a wall around that too, you know? And that encourages my people to not look at our tribe and our people in like Hajon way, you know, or beauty, or, you know,
Sure.
I mean, and so that kind of gets to me, and I'm kind of like on this new path of, you know,
Let's clean everybody up.
yeah, and right now I'm really kind of pissed off too because of Nathan Phillips and how he represented all of it. But
Nathan
anyway,
Phillips is
yeah,
from Omaha.
yeah.
It's way down south. Well, the Northern Plains Indians do have more of a drinking problem than other groups.
Mhm.
Okay, but Northern Plains includes North Dakota, Montana, at least eastern Montana. Well, it's still you guys. You guys are Plains Indians. But yeah, it's the numbers are a lot higher than they are down here, strangely. So.
But if you look at it nowadays, our young, the youth, they're really not turning to alcohol
Well, one of the
as they used to be.
One of the beauties of being up north was that I saw a lot of people that were recovered alcoholics. They were recovering alcoholics. They had been drinkers when in their youth, and then they gave it up. I mean, practically everybody at the college where I taught had been a drinker in their youth, and they talked about it all the time. Unfortunately, when they talked about having a good time, they talked about when they were drunk instead of, you know, they've been sober for 18 years, but they didn't talk about those 18 years. They talked about when they were drinking. As strange as that is. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of people that don't drink. Obviously, there's a lot of people that don't drink. If more people in the world don't drink than do drink, who are these people? Well, they're obviously not people in the United States. People in the United States drink a lot. One of the statistics that I saw coming out of Montana was the white people in Montana drink a lot more than the natives do, even though there's 80% alcoholism rate on select reservations. The white people still drink a lot more than the Indians do.
And then we have all the Hutterite colonies that make
They
their
drink like
own
fish.
alcohol
Oh,
there,
yeah.
and then they bring it to the reservation and trade for tires or wood or your dog. They'll give you a bottle of Hutterite wine.
They'll steal your berries right off your tree.
And anybody knows that back home Hutterite wine is like the best kind of commodity to have around, you know, if you're just gonna have a glass of wine. But
It's
it's like a
strong.
psychedelic drink.
Yeah, it's really strong stuff. Yeah, well, there's no control over how much alcohol is in there. The point is, there's a lot of people in the world that don't drink. Hindus don't drink, Muslims don't drink, Mormons aren't supposed to drink, Baptists aren't supposed to drink either. So there's a lot of people out there that actually are teetotalers. They don't drink alcohol. That's one of the reasons why it's only 1.5 billion. 180 million people worldwide abuse illicit drugs. 160 million people worldwide smoke marijuana each year. Most of these people are in Europe and the United States, Australia, Canada. Canada has just legalized marijuana at the beginning of the year. They legalized marijuana. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be a huge mess for Montana. It's going to be okay for Washington because they've legalized marijuana. But Montana, you've got that open border. Their drugs are just going to be flooding into Montana. But they were already coming down from Canada.
It's legalized on our reservation in Canada, the Kainai, Siksika, and the Pagan. They have marijuana there now, and they were saying that they're looking at an estimated like 1 point some, or you know, but they're selling it for medicinal.
Oh,
Yeah.
I've got a headache. I think I need to smoke a joint. Oh, my back hurts. I hurt my finger. Tomorrow it's going to be I have an earache. So. It has been estimated that 20 to 60% of all hospital beds are inhabited due to drug abuse. That's alcohol or drug abuse. It's really irritating to be working along, and somebody comes into the emergency room, and they're messed up, they're really messed up. They're really sick, so you put them in the hospital, but they take twice as long or 3 times as long to recover because of their drug abuse or alcohol usage. Really irritating. Illicit drugs figure into the economic structures both where they are grown and where they are used. Heroin, cocaine, marijuana, ecstasy is a chemical formula, of course, and methamphetamine is a chemical formula. What did I read? Most of our we're not manufacturing our own methamphetamines anymore. How's that? It's coming up from Mexico. Yeah, they're not smuggling cocaine anymore. Well, they are, but they're also smuggling methamphetamines.
What do you mean? They're not. We're not making meth anymore in the States.
We busted too many lads. It's too difficult.
Were you
Remember
here
they were
during the
cooked.
convocation?
I'm sorry.
Were you here during the convocation? Remember the convocation? And remember how security was saying that
Right.
they have a meth lab
2.5 miles. Yeah,
and that's like only a half a mile to my
Right.
house, you know?
Right.
And so I'm like, where is this place at? But you know,
Did you
it
figure
is
out where it
true.
was? Do you know who it is?
No, I don't. But I think that it is, I mean, people are
Well, they are
making it,
still
but-
cooking meth. I'm not saying they're not cooking meth. There's a lot of meth coming across the border.
Oh,
And methamphetamine seems to be as serious a problem as heroin now. So that the heroin smuggling was something. Of course, the reality is we're getting a lot of our opiates and opioids from the doctors. We don't need to smuggle it across the border. We don't have to worry about black tar, heroin, or white heroin, or whatever. Now we can just go to the doctor and say, geez, you know, my back hurts, and it's been hurting for 3 months, and can you give me something to make the pain go away? And you can't, doctors don't know, they can't draw your blood and find out how much pain you're in. You know, they can't do any of that stuff. They have no idea how much pain you're in. So you can lie all you like, and a lot of people do. Illegal heroin is grown in 4 areas of the world. The Golden Crescent is an area in Southwest Asia that encompasses areas of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. My brother was stationed in Afghanistan in 2005. I think I've told you this story. My brother's kind of, everybody in my family, we're kind of atheists, especially the males are not religious people. Let's say that. Let's just say we're not religious people. Anyway, so when he was over there, he was in charge of an area, of a select area. And so he went to the Afghans and he said, look, you need to stop growing. You need to stop growing opium poppies. You need to stop manufacturing opium and turning it into heroin. And they said, okay, we'll do that. We'll slow it down, is what they told him. So it slowed way down, and they started warehousing all of this extra opium they had, all this extra heroin that they had. They started putting it in warehouses instead of marketing it. Isn't that nice? Well, my brother was only there for a year, and the guy that replaced him was an evangelical Christian. I'm not saying anything bad about evangelical Christians, but the man wouldn't shut up. So my brother, who never talked about religion at all, he was fine with all of these individuals that he was dealing with, but the evangelical Christian tried to convert all these Muslims to Christianity, and it pissed them off. And so they sold that whole warehouse full of stuff, of heroin. Yeah, just to spite him, because they didn't like him, because he wouldn't leave them alone. He tried to convert them. Nobody likes to be converted. If you've got an idea, you don't want somebody to try to tell you that you're wrong. And it made them mad. And so they sold all their heroin on the market. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. He had it curbed. It was slowed way down. They were warehousing all of their stuff. They were afraid that he was a nice guy. I mean, he's not a bad guy. He was a nice guy. And he didn't try to convert them to Christianity. So they were trying to do what he wanted them to do. And they wanted him to stay. They gave him all this stuff when he left. They were upset that he left. I told you that he would set up all these convoys to, you know, to resupply the troops in up in the mountains and whatnot. And he was never attacked. But as soon as the other guy took over, they attacked him every time he sent out a convoy. I mean, it was that bad. And the reason was because the man wouldn't shut up. He tried to convert everybody. Now, I understand that Christians have to proselytize. That's the rules of the Bible. But, you know, there's sometimes you need to shut your mouth. Shut your mouth. Go away. Anyway, that's what happened. It was a mess. The Golden Triangle encompasses parts of Southeast Asian countries of Thailand, Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, and Laos. And this is the section where, all of the guys in Vietnam got their heroin, their Thai sticks, which is heroin and marijuana. It's marijuana soaked in with heroin embedded in it, Thai sticks. Anyway, yeah, that's where it came from. So a lot of guys came back from Vietnam smoking pot. A lot of guys came back from Vietnam with a heroin addiction because it's right there. I mean, it's right here. And it was cheap. I mean, they were giving it away. It was pretty bad stuff. Anyway, that was a problem as well. We had troops in we had Air Force bases in Thailand. Of course, we had troops in South Vietnam. But Thailand, of course, it's illegal to sell heroin, but nobody arrested anybody for doing it. So there's just tons and tons of heroin coming out of Thailand. And of course, we had the 3 Air Force bases there. Mexico exports a form of heroin that is dark in color, and it's called either black tar or brown heroin. It's not white like most heroin is. How do you tell the difference between, I mean, heroin and cocaine look a lot alike. And if you've ever seen that really strange movie, the lady snorts heroin instead of cocaine. She thinks she's snorting cocaine, she snorts heroin, and she goes into cardiac arrest. And they finally inject her heart with epinephrine to get her going again. Yeah, it was, Uma Thurman was the lady. And what was that stupid movie?
Pulp Fiction?
Pulp Fiction, that's the one, yeah, okay. It looks a lot alike. You can tell the difference. And the way you tell the difference is that cocaine numbs you. If you snort it up your nose becomes numb. It's a vasoconstrictor, so you can't feel anything. But you can if you take cocaine and rub it on your gums, it'll numb your gums. Heroin doesn't do that. And that's the way you tell the difference. And that's one of the reasons why when they see a white powder, they rub it on their gums trying to figure out if it's heroin or... I think I got one chair over here. If Denise will let you sit beside her. I guess she will, okay. Okay, so we've looked at 2 different areas where they've got lots and lots of heroin, 3 different areas. Yeah, 3 different areas. The Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. This is where the Brits were growing all their heroin, or all their opium to sell to the Chinese in the 1830s. And then we have, this area was closed to them. The Brits couldn't get in here. Then the others, the Golden Triangle, Laos, Burma, and Thailand, or Myanmar. It's Myanmar now, they don't call it Burma anymore. And then we have Mexico. They grow opium down there, but it's darker. It's darker in color, and that's why they call it black tar heroin. And then the last one is Colombia. They grow opium poppies in Colombia as well. So they not only export cocaine to the United States, but also a white heroin. So it's a stronger, pure heroin that comes out of Colombia. White heroin found in the Golden Triangle, Golden Crescent, and in Colombia is purer and stronger than the heroin that comes out of Mexico. So we've got heroin coming out of Colombia as well. Now you can see if you're going to smuggle it over the land, you're going to have to drive. You're going to have to drive your trucks through Panama, and Panama, it's not very big right here, as you can plainly see. It's pretty dang narrow. So in essence, the Panamanians could stop all the, they also have to go over the Panama Canal. They have to drive over the Panama Canal. So there's a couple different places that we could stop drug trade if we could get the Panamanians to do it. We used to own the Panama Canal. We used to control Panama. And we gave it back to the Panamanians in 2000 because we stole it to begin with. Of course, at least we're giving them back their stuff. We're not giving you guys back your stuff. 90% of the world's supply of illicit heroin comes from the poppy fields of Afghanistan. This is a problem. If you remember Afghanistan before 9/11, Afghanistan was controlled by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They were marketing heroin all over the world. The Russians tried to stop the trade. It didn't work. Then we invaded Afghanistan, and so we started fighting against the Taliban. We pushed Al-Qaeda out into the periphery. Osama bin Laden, of course, disappeared into the Tora Bora Mountains. But the reality is we saw him, and I talked to a guy who said, I had him in my sights. He's a sniper, and he said, I had him in my sights. I could have killed him, but I was told not to shoot him. And the reason they did that is because they had a trace on him, and they could if they were able to do away with the hierarchy of Al-Qaeda by following people coming to see Osama bin Laden. Finally, by 2011, I guess, it was around 2011, they had, was it 2011? Yeah, 2011 was when Osama bin Laden was killed. By that time, they completely destroyed Al-Qaeda, their hierarchy, and by that time they decided just to go ahead and execute him. But they used him, which was kind of cool. Anyway, okay, so this is a problem. We've got all these drugs coming out of Afghanistan, and they're still coming out of Afghanistan today. Taliban is financing their war. Al-Qaeda is pretty much gone. ISIS is still around, and they were financing their terrorist attacks using the money coming out of Afghanistan as well. 60% of Afghanistan's wealth comes from their opium sales. The United States' efforts to curb production has resulted in an increase of 50%. Even though we were trying to stop it, slow it down, it worked in the other direction. And one of the reasons is for the reason I just explained to you. My brother had it slowed down in his area. He had it almost stopped, and as soon as the guy that irritated everybody came in, he reversed the whole process. And that's one of the reasons why it increased 50% instead of decreased. It should have decreased. We do have some control over there, but not control over drug trade. All right. This is a sad story. The Nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang party dealt with the drug tongs of Shanghai while they controlled China. These guys were drug lords, and he was the president of China. This is during World War II. Of course, the Japanese had invaded China. They had seized part of China, and he was financing his war. He was buying his arms and ammunition through money that he got from the drug trade, the Kuomintang. So this is the official government of China is using drugs to buy arms and ammunition. Chiang Kai-shek. This is Chiang Kai-shek right here, the guy in the sunglasses. That's Chiang Kai-shek. That's his wife, and these are American generals. We kept trying to help during the war. We wanted to send them arms and ammunition, but we couldn't because the Japanese had they controlled the entire coast. So there was not a whole lot we could do. But the Chinese were still getting arms and ammunition. We were getting them arms and ammunition any way that we could, but they were buying all the rest of their stuff, usually from the Japanese, through the drug trade. They were making lots and lots of money. Shanghai, of course, the Japanese didn't want them to trade. They didn't want anybody to trade in opium. But the drug tongs in Shanghai were still open despite the fact the Japanese controlled it. After the Kuomintang were expelled from China, this happened in 1948, 1949, there was a revolution in China, the communists versus the nationalist Chinese. The nationalist Chinese, surprisingly enough, were defeated very readily, very quickly. They were driven to a small island in the China Sea called Taiwan, and this became China because the Chinese government was there. So from 1949 until 1972, when Nixon normalized relations with the People's Republic of China, we pretended that that little island was China. And the 1.5 billion people that lived on the mainland didn't exist. It was this amazing mind meld that was going on in the United States. I have an encyclopedia that was printed in 1958. And in that encyclopedia it says that China is that little island of Taiwan. And you can, if you look at the history of China, it shows mainland China, but if you talk about modern China, it completely ignores the fact that all these 1.8 billion or 1.5 billion people exist. As stupid as that sounds. And we were doing this in the United States. We were pretending that they didn't exist. Now, in 1950, we fought in Korea. Well, Korea is a little chunk that comes off of mainland China. And we pretended that those 1.5 billion Chinese didn't exist. And we were fighting that war, and in 1950 we went right up to the Chinese border. And as the generals, of course the generals had to do what everybody told them to do. They pretended that China didn't exist. That piece of land didn't exist. That 1.5 billion people didn't exist. What happened next? The Chinese invaded North Korea, and they almost wiped us out. So all of a sudden we're fighting against a country that we don't even recognize. We're fighting against people that we pretend don't exist. And they almost kicked us out of the country, but we were able to hold on, and we were able to drive them back, and we drove them back to the, whatever the parallel is, 45th parallel, 39th parallel. And we were able to save South Korea, fighting against people that didn't exist. I know, isn't this stupid? Politics. So they still didn't exist. We still didn't recognize them as a country. And this is in 1954. The war stopped in 1954. It never ended. It's still going on. And that's one of the things that Kim Jong-un and the South Korean president are talking about right now. Stopping the war. It's been going on since 1950, since the war started. So here we're fighting against people that don't exist. Shadow people that we don't recognize these people, so they don't really exist. And we didn't start recognizing them as humans, as living people until 1972, when Richard Nixon normalized relations with them. Okay, so we've got these drug dealers that have become who have become the leaders in the Chinese in Taiwan. We had to pass a law in Congress to allow us to start calling China, the People's Republic of China, China. Because before that, if something was made in China, it was actually made in Taiwan. Now if something's made in Taiwan, it says made in Taiwan. But before that, if you bought something and it was made in Taiwan, it said made in China, because that was the only China that we recognized, this little island in the China Sea. After the Kuomintang were expelled from China, they continued to grow and market opium along the Thai-Burma border in order to buy weapons for defense against the communists. So we've got the drug trade still going on. And this is heroin, this is opium that we're talking about. This is really strong stuff. And this national government is actually the one that is marketing all these drugs. It gets more exciting than that. So we backed, as the United States, we backed these guys. So in order to help them buy guns and ammunition to fight off the communists, we helped them market their drugs. Really? Yes, the CIA helped them market their drugs. So the CIA got into the drug market. This gets more exciting because we're going to get into Vietnam in just a minute. So then the Vietnam War started. The Vietnam War actually started in 1954. The French were in there and they were defeated, and Vietnam became an independent country. They split it in half, just like they split Korea in half. There's a North Korea and a South Korea. There was a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. But we had a problem. We were Americans, so we couldn't cross international borders. So as Americans, we had to stay we were supposed to stay in Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese, of course, they could do anything they wanted. So they were moving all their arms and ammunition to the south through Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. They had a trail that went through. It was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we could bomb it, but we couldn't put troops over in Laos and Cambodia. Eventually, of course, in 1970 we did, and of course there was a big uproar about invading an alien country. But before that, the CIA got involved. The CIA was involved in Vietnam from the very beginning. They were involved when France was in charge. And of course, one of the things they did, they tried to find allies. Well, the best allies they could find were two mountain tribes groups that lived in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. They could go any place that they wanted. They weren't citizens of any country. There were two groups, the two major groups that we hired, and these people were already drug smugglers. And that's the reason that they knew where to go. That's the reason that they were so good at surreptitious movement through the jungles. The two groups were the Ho and the Hmong. H-O and H-M-O-N-G. The Ho and the Hmong. And they were mountain people. They were mountain people, and they were very distinctive. They were also quite vicious. They didn't take prisoners. They just killed whoever they came across. So hopefully, with a smile on their face. That was the weird part. So these guys were pretty ugly. I mean, it was pretty vicious. And this war went on for a long, long time. And they would ambush the North Vietnamese coming down from North Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They would ambush them and they'd just kill everybody. They didn't mess around. They didn't take prisoners. They just slit everybody's throat, or they'd just shoot them all. And they were really good fighters. They were probably the best fighters we had in Vietnam. The Hmong were excellent allies against the North Koreans, the North Vietnamese, and the Viet Cong as they moved freely through Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam and fought the communist soldiers who encroached in their area. And they felt like this was their area, and these were aliens coming into their area, so they didn't mind killing them. And of course, we armed them. All this wonderful stuff was taking place. Whoops. So what's the end of the story? We lost in Vietnam. We left there in 1975. So what happened to the Hmong and the Hmong? The Ho and the Hmong. What happened to these guys? These were our allies. We hired them. So what happened to them?
They kept killing.
Well, the ones that stayed there did, but we transported as many as we could back to the States. And it was the CIA that did it. The CIA transported them back to the States. Of course, we left all those Vietnamese in Vietnam, but these allies, as many as we could, we brought them back to the States. And so if you go to Detroit, Michigan, there's an enclave of Hmong. If you've seen the movie Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood, the people that are in that movie are actually Hmong people. If you look at them, they have really round faces. They're really interesting people. They're really nice people. If you don't piss them off, they're really nice people. But so there's an enclave in Minneapolis, There's an enclave in Detroit. I don't know why they settled them in such cold places. There's some in, not very many in Chicago. The Ho are in, where are they? There's a group in Los Angeles. You find the Ho every once in a while. You'll find these individuals, but they're mountain people. They're kind of short, not very. They're kind of short, but they have round faces. They're really kind of interesting people. Anyway, so if you went to Vietnam, one of the things that you ran into all kinds of people. And they didn't look the same. If you talk to the mountain people were called montagnards. They're mostly people that were like the Hmong and the Ho. The people that lived down near on the rivers, these were mostly Chinese descent. There was an indigenous group in Vietnam called the Min, and they look different than everybody else. It's really kind of interesting. If you're there and you see these people, you go, oh, that guy's a mountain person, that guy's he lives down by the ocean, and that guy's he's a Min. You could tell the difference between the three. As curious as that is, if you cared to look. Cocaine doesn't grow just anywhere. Cocaine grows only in one area. It grows in the humid mountain valleys of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. It grows in the Andes. It doesn't grow in the Rockies. It doesn't grow in Europe. It doesn't grow in Africa. It grows only in that place. Cocaine has been at the forefront of political problems in Colombia for over half a century. Drug cartels operate with impunity throughout the country and control many of the decisions being made locally and nationally. Lots of shooting going on, lots of drug cartels controlling things. They're executing judges, and all kinds of interesting things are taking place. Right now in the news, Venezuela is in the news, and it's because their old president won't leave. He was voted out, and he won't go. He won't go. He's staying. And this is happening right now, I mean, as we speak. So the question is, will the army of course has all the power in Venezuela, who will the army back? Will they back the guy that was elected president, or will they back the guy that won't leave the presidency? And we'll see what happens. We have come out in favor of the guy that was elected, so we'll see what happens. As interesting as that is. Worldwide, people have died, 25 million people have died from AIDS, and another 40 million people are infected with the HIV virus. 25 million people, that's the size of the population of Texas, and plus the population of Montana. About 24 million people live in Texas, and 1 million people live in Montana. So if you took all the people in Texas and all the people in Montana and killed them, that would be how many people have died from AIDS. The number of people that are infected with AIDS today, that if you take all the people in Oregon and all the people in California and killed them, that's how many people have AIDS. In the United States, around 900,000 people are infected with HIV, while 500,000 people have died from AIDS in the United States. Why is there such a discrepancy? Because it came to the United States late. Not only that, but Africa has a really severe problem with AIDS, and it just spread to the United States in a surreptitious manner. That's one of the reasons why we have so few, 500,000. I guess that's not so few. Now we have drugs to treat it, which is kind of exciting. I was in on the beginning of this stuff. I was working in a hospital, and we had no idea what was going on. We couldn't identify it. If we saw somebody with AIDS and they had full-blown AIDS, we knew that they had AIDS, but we had no way of detecting it. We didn't know how to treat it. So we were fighting to figure out what was going on. You can imagine if you're working in medicine and something comes along and you don't know what it is. You don't even know what to call it. It's just killing people. And you don't know what to do with these guys. I mean, can you touch them? You know, do you have to burn their bodies? What's going on? With the Ebola virus, I don't know if you know about the Ebola virus, but it makes you discharge blood. And it comes out of your eyes, it comes out of your nose, comes out of your mouth. you discharge blood, and the blood's is infected. It's infected with the Ebola virus. So what do you do with somebody that dies from Ebola? Well, you have to get rid of the body, but you got to get rid of the body in a way that it destroys the entire thing. So you have to burn them. So you can imagine we've got this other disease. I mean, that's fairly obvious. You've got this huge discharge of blood. The person just bleeds out, and it's ugly. It's really ugly. But you've got this other disease. You've got HIV, and the person wastes away to nothing. How infective are they? That's the question. What on them is infective? Is just touching their skin, is that going to give you the AIDS virus? At the time, we didn't even know it was a virus. I was in on the very beginning. It was scary.
So Ebola came first and then?
No, Ebola came second.
Oh.
HIV came first. Turns out HIV's been around since the 1950s, but it was only killing people in isolated places in Africa. And then somebody from Africa immigrated to Haiti, and so then it infected Haiti. And somebody from the United States went down to Haiti, had sex with a guy with AIDS, and he took it back up to New York. So it got into the gay community in New York. Then of course, some gay guy in New York went to San Francisco and started infecting people in San Francisco and Los Angeles. I mean, we followed this stuff and we had no clue what was going on. It was mostly on the East Coast and the West Coast. Scary, scary stuff. And here I was working in a hospital in Omaha. Of course, it's not in Omaha yet. We haven't seen it in Omaha, but they're running out of hospital space up along the East Coast. So they started sending people from New Jersey with AIDS to Omaha because we had so many beds in Omaha. I know, it was really weird. But we didn't know where it came from. We didn't even know if it was a virus or not. So here we are, we're treating these people, trying to keep them, I don't know. What are you going to do? What do? You have no idea where it's coming from, but it's killing people. And if you've got AIDS, you're dead. You're gone. There's nothing we can do to stop it. We didn't even know what it was. Is this the scariest stuff you've ever heard of? You've got a disease that nobody understands. It was scary. At the time, we didn't wear gloves. We just touched people. We just touched people without gloves on. We didn't wear masks. The only time we wore a mask was in isolation. It's the only time we wore masks. It's the only time we put on gloves. We didn't even have cheap gloves. Gloves were made out of rubber, and rubber's fairly expensive. So surgeons had gloves. The nurses handling the patients that were infected with pneumonia or the measles or something, they wore gloves. The rest of us, we didn't wear gloves at all. Now everybody wears gloves. The only diseases you could get back then was hepatitis B and maybe syphilis, but the number of people with syphilis isn't that high, so we didn't have to worry about it. I've done autopsies without gloves on. This is back in the 70s, before AIDS. And we didn't know how to kill it. We had no idea what it was. And then finally, of course, they figured out what it was. Now, the weird part was that they were trying to figure out what was going on in Europe because they had so many people that were infected with it. We had a lot of people that were infected with it in the United States, but who was president in the 1980s, early 1980s? Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan didn't want to admit that there was a problem. He didn't want to admit that it was a problem that he didn't want to deal with it because he didn't want to spend any money on it. He didn't want to spend any money on it. So it wasn't until like 1984. This whole thing started in of course it started in the 1950s, but we didn't see it until the early 1980s. But it wasn't until 1984 that he threw any money at it. And he threw just a little bit of money, and people are begging him to admit that there's a problem with AIDS. Oh no, we don't have any AIDS in the United States. It was irritating. If you work in medicine and you're touching people and you're potentially becoming contaminated with this stuff, it was really irritating. It was just like what's going on right now with the shutdown. This is horrible. We've got soldiers out there that aren't getting paid, and they still have to protect us. That's Coast Guard. That's not right. My wife is flying from Moline, Illinois to Albuquerque. And she has to go through TSA. She has to be screened through the TSA. TSA hasn't been paid for 34 days. Most of these people can't afford not to. Where are they getting their food? They haven't been paid for 34 days. So she has to go through security to get on the airplane. And she has to fly in an airplane that's being controlled by air traffic controllers that haven't been paid for 34 days. It's dangerous out there. Horrible. The Border Patrol's not being paid. It was the same thing. As frustrating as I feel, because my wife is in an insecure environment. She's flying in an airplane, and the air traffic controller may be working overtime and not being paid for it. There are a lot of people calling in sick. There's a possibility that something horrible could happen. We don't like to think about that kind of stuff, but it happens, okay? We can pretend that it's not happening. This is what was going on with the AIDS epidemic. Reagan was pretending that it didn't exist, but it was killing people all over the United States, especially in New York and Los Angeles. Remember, he was an actor, and when his friends started dying of AIDS, that's when he admitted that there was a problem. And actors started dying. Rock Hudson. Don't cry. It's okay. Doris Day's buddy, Rock Hudson, died. Anyway, okay. When the AIDS epidemic first hit in 1982, 1983, it was mostly caused by unsafe sex between homosexual males. And this is another reason that he didn't do anything. Remember, he was a Republican. He was also a conservative. And there were evangelicals that were going, praise be to Lord, the Lord. These abominations are being punished for their abomination. They didn't want us to do anything about the AIDS epidemic because it was killing the right people. As stupid as that sounds, I know that sounds so stupid, but this was going on. And if you listened to the news and you read the newspapers and you read the news magazines, you would read this stuff. And these evangelicals are coming out and screaming, it's a punishment for all these homosexuals, and it's a good thing, and we can't do anything, we can't stop it, because it's the Lord's way of cleansing the world of homosexuality. Oh, it was weird, it was so crazy. But that's where it started. Well, of course, it didn't stay there. It got into the intravenous drug injecting population, got into that population. As long as it was killing gay males, there were a lot of people that didn't want to do anything about it. But when it started infecting babies, started infecting women, it started infecting babies, and it got into the intravenous drug injecting population, all of a sudden people got more interested. As long as it was killing the right people, we didn't care. As long as, that's as far as those people were concerned. As odd as that seems. If there were an epidemic on the reservation, would the people in Washington do anything about it? It's just killing Indians. Would they do anything about it? Nobody cares until it starts killing white people. Really? That sounds horrible, doesn't it? But is that true? What are they doing about diabetes? Yeah. This is an epidemic that we need to deal with. Are we doing anything about it? We're throwing a little bit of money at it. But if it was white people that were dying, of course they would do more. Hepatitis C is a liver infection that infects 4 million Americans. If anybody's ever been to LA, LA is just a massive area. It's spread out all over Southern California. It goes almost all the way to San Diego. Within 50 miles of Los Angeles proper, there are 15 million people. Los Angeles itself only has 4 million people. So that's how many people have hepatitis C. Let me tell you a quick story about hepatitis C. I had a student who was she shot up crystal meth. Yeah, she shot up crystal meth. And she was very fastidious about it. She always cleaned her needle. She always hid her needle. She always hid her stash. If you know anything about people that shoot up meth, it's not like marijuana. If somebody's got marijuana, they share it with all their friends, right? And not the way it usually works. They try to share it with everybody. Crystal meth isn't that way. If you've got meth, then you want to use it all yourself. You don't share it with your buddies. You don't say, "Come over to my house. We'll shoot up with my meth." The only time you do that is if you need money, and then you sell it to them so you can get more of it. That's the way it works. Meth makes you very selfish. Anyway, so she had a stash of meth. She hid it in her medicine cabinet. It's a medicine, so you hide it in your medicine cabinet, along with her needle and her syringe. And everything was fine. Everything was fine. She was shooting up with her meth, and she was hiding it from everybody. Well, she had a friend that came to town and needed a place to crash. So she allowed her friend to come over and crash at her place. She went to work. She was a cocktail waitress. She was a cocktail waitress. So she went to work, worked an 8-hour shift, came back, shut up with her meth. Everything was fine. You know, she went into the bathroom, locked the door, shut up with her meth. Everything was fine. 2 months later, she started having pains in her side. And she went to the doctor. She said, "I'm having pains in the side." He said, "Are you an intravenous drug user?" And she said, "No, of course." Then he lifted up her sleeve and saw all the tracks on her arm and said, "Yeah, right. You're not an intravenous drug user." What had happened? Her friend had found her stash, and her friend had shot up with her meth, and her friend had hepatitis C, and her friend gave her hepatitis C because she didn't clean out the needle. That's what friends are for. That's what friends are for. I was wondering, okay. 85 to 90% of all intravenous drug users are infected with hepatitis C virus, mostly from sharing needles, unfortunately. And this is one of the reasons why she didn't do that. She had so many friends who had hepatitis C, and she didn't want to use needles with those guys. She always was very fastidious, and then her friend found her stash and gave her hepatitis C. She's still alive. And they have a pharmaceutical to treat hepatitis C. It actually makes it go away. How am I doing on time? Yeah, I'm okay. All right. Ever since the Roaring '20s, people have been mixing the coolest of music with psychoactive drugs. In the 1920s, it was jazz. It was mixed, and they mixed it with cocaine and bootleg liquor. The women were called flappers, and the men were called jazzbos. So in the 1920s, if you were cool, if you were a female, you were a flapper, and you wore a dress that flattened your breasts out. That for some reason, women wanted to look like little boys, and so they were really, really skinny. Of course, if you snorted cocaine, you could be skinny. Well, not so skinny. Anyway, you could be skinny, and they wore dresses that flattened themselves out. This is in the 1920s. In the 1950s, the music was the blues. The psychoactive drugs were heroin and whiskey. The men and the women were either called beats or beatniks. Did I say gin? Cocaine, whiskey, and gin. They used to make bathtub gin. Anyway, in the 50s, they were beats or beatniks. If you've ever seen Dobie Gillis, the movie Dobie Gillis, I'm sorry, the television show Dobie Gillis, Maynard G. Krebs is a beatnik. He's not a hippie. This is pre-hippie. This is in the late 50s, early 60s. We didn't have hippies yet, so they had beatniks. And of course, they had beards and fuzzy hair, and they wore really strange clothes. Anyway, those were beatniks, 1950s. So let's go into the 60s and 70s. Well, we still have cool people out there. The music was hard rock, acid rock, became really interesting. The psychoactive drugs that fueled the music was LSD, speed, marijuana, and wine. The people were hippies and the women were called chicks or birds. They called them birds in England and they called them chicks in the United States. And they were all cool people. They grew a lot long beards. They didn't cut their hair. They didn't do anything with their facial hair. They just let it grow until it got too long. They didn't want to look like ZZ Top, of course. So that's the cool people. Now the people that did all this stuff are mostly dead. I know, they're all dead. You can't do this kind of stuff to yourself. You can't do that other stuff either. You can't do this stuff either. You can. The people in the 1920s died young. They died in their 40s and 50s. But at least they had a good time. Okay, so if you want to have a good time, then you become one of these people. As we drifted into the new millennium, the music became techno or electronic trance music. The psychoactive drugs that fueled the craze were MDMA, marijuana, nitrous oxide, ketamine, GHB, and beer. Now there's a problem with this stuff. This stuff knocks you out. So does this stuff. These are both date rape drugs, but they became very popular. So people were using this stuff, and they were getting high. But they had to be with people that would protect them. But if they weren't with people that were protecting them, potentially they would end up raped or molested or something. Hopefully that's as far as it goes. The music was, of course, electronic or techno music. The participants were referred to as ravers. Now this wasn't nearly as popular in the United States as it was over in Europe. And this, of course, was in the 90s and the 2000s, and the beginning of the 2000s. If you know anybody from Europe, they talk about this kind of stuff. They go to raves. A lot of people used a lot of MDMA, ecstasy. They used a lot of ecstasy. Now, ecstasy makes you feel really good. It also allows you to be hypnotized by light. And that's one of the reasons why laser shows are so important to these people. They would become hypnotized by light. As you can see, they're just moving these. See, look at this. She's holding her head. Look at it. As funny as that is. They used to have a big party in Berlin. I mean, and you can see how many people we're talking about. These are, the sound stage is actually over here. These are these towers what do they call those things? Speakers, thank you. Yeah, they're speakers. Yeah, and this is all over Berlin. I mean, it's huge. It's the second largest gathering of humanity in our history.
What's it called?
What do they call it? I can't think. It's some kind of rave. It's like summer rave. You can look it up. Just type in there Berlin and rave and you'll get this stuff. I can't remember what they call it. I've never been to it. I mean, first of all, this is about as many people as I want to be around, but I couldn't stand being in the middle of all these people. I couldn't stand it. I have a form of acolophobia where I don't like crowds. And it's not that I'm afraid that I'm going to get hurt. It's that I can't protect everybody. I have this need to make sure that everybody's okay. I don't know. It's a medical thing. It's a military thing. I have no idea where it comes from. Anyway, it's a disease that I'm trying to find out. So right now we are all protected. If there was a shooter in the room, we would be able to block the door to keep him from coming in. Don't worry about it. I got a plan. I already know what I'm going to do. Anytime I go into a classroom, I make sure that I can secure the room. It's the first thing that I do when I go into a room is make sure that I can secure it. So you guys are all safe. Don't worry about it. Don't worry, I'll protect you if anything happens. How am I doing on time? Well, almost. Okay. Marijuana continues to create controversy. Legalized in many states for medicinal purposes. People are required to have a prescription to use it. 10 states have legalized marijuana. There are 30 states in the United States that have medicinal marijuana, which means there are 10 states that have where marijuana is illegal. Only 10 states in the union. One of them is my home state, or my current living state of Iowa. Iowa doesn't have any marijuana laws. They don't have medicinal marijuana, and they don't have legalized marijuana. Marijuana continues to be the most widely used illegal drug throughout much of the world, including the United States. Actually, Canada has legalized marijuana. In Canada, it was never criminalized. So even in the 1970s, the marijuana in Canada, if you got caught with marijuana, they took it away from you, and you had to pay a fine. They didn't put you in jail. But other places in the world, it's still illegal, including Turkey, where they make hashish, which is kind of interesting. The destructive effects of tobacco prompted many countries to try to curb its use. Cuba banned smoking in public places. Ireland has banned smoking in pubs. In many states in the United States, smoking is banned in any public area. This includes Iowa, Illinois, Arizona, and Montana, places where I have lived. This is an advertisement from the 1950s. As you can see, Ronald Reagan, our former president, is going to give everybody cigarettes for Christmas. Yeah, it's exciting. At Chesterfields. We're not just messing around with any old type of cigarette. It's Chesterfields. As late as 1966, almost half the population smoked regularly, 42.6%. That's a lot of people smoking a lot of cigarettes. By 2005, the percentage of regular smokers in the United States had declined to less than 1/4 of the adult population, about 22.5%. This decline had much to do with the discovery that cigarettes contain many carcinogens that cause disturbing medical problems. 1,178 people die every day from smoking cigarettes. 1,178. A study in England showed that smoking can reduce life expectancy by 10 years. That means if you stop, you're okay. But if you stop, you're okay, but you've already taken the 10 years off your life. So if you've ever smoked cigarettes for an extended length of time, the probability is that you're going to live 10 years longer than you would have if you had never smoked. That's something to think about. Of course, if you've already done it, there's nothing you can do about it. But if you haven't, don't start. This stuff is poison. This stuff is horrible. It's toxic. Why don't we stop right here? We'll pick this up next time. I'll finish the chapter finally.